In 1915, a vexed, angry woman murdered nearly 300 people. And she did it with magic. Hello, and welcome to Rope. According to OxfordReference.com, magic is defined as the power of using supernatural or other unseen forces to apparently influence events or human behavior, and it's been practiced since human culture began. Many ancient writings teach that reality is not what it appears to be, and that humankind has forgotten the true nature of existence. These writings state that the mind is at the very center of everything, and if a person could just reach past that veil, he or she could manipulate reality in such a way that others would call it magic. While most of the scientific community believes this to be complete nonsense, some scientists are taking a deeper look at these ancient ideas. We've talked about Dr. Dean Radin in a previous report. Amy actually discussed the results of some experiments that he had done with telepathy using what's called the Ganzfeld method. If you haven't seen that report, you may want to. Dr. Dean Radin has worked at SRI International, the University of Edinburgh, Bell Labs, GTE Laboratories, and even Princeton. He's currently the chief scientist at the Institute for Noetic Science at California's Institute for Integral Studies. He's authored hundreds of scientific papers showing scientific proof through rigorous, strict experiments that the mind can and does have a definite effect on reality. He's written 4 bestsellers, including The Conscious Universe, Entangled Minds, Supernormal, and Real Magic. Arguably, Radin has studied this topic more than anyone else, and he unequivocally says that, quote, "Magic is a natural aspect of reality, and each of us can tap into this power with diligent practice," unquote. In this video, we're going to look at the possibility that magic just might be real. And we'll do this by examining 4 separate stories. The first 2 are of a positive nature, and the last 2, well, they're much darker. But all of these stories seem to be impossible. First, we'll look at a man who was told that he would never walk again. But then, using nothing but the power of mind, he baffled his doctors. Then we'll look at a man who says that he met a teacher of the mystic arts, and after studying with him for a bit, he became so proficient that he was actually able to stop time itself. And then for the second half of our video, we'll look at 2 accounts for women who became vexed and wielded the power of mind for darker purposes. The first woman supposedly murdered a couple of people close to her using voodoo. But the second one, a woman down in Frenier, Louisiana, was reported to have murdered almost 300 people, and all at one day. And then stay with us for our fact or fiction section. There, I'm going to take just a second and look at these 4 stories more objectively. And then Amy is going to come on, and you won't want to miss that part of our video because she's going to be sharing another study from Dean Radin. And this one was a study involving voodoo. And you just might be surprised to learn the science behind voodoo. So, this story begins over 50 years ago in a bookstore. In the summer of 1970, a young 25-year-old named Morris Goodman was on the fast track to nowhere. He had dropped out of school and he had very little purpose or direction in his life. One day, while he was lazily perusing the shelves of a local store, he came across a book on the powers of the mind, and it intrigued him. So he bought it, took it home, and he put it on his nightstand, where he says that it sat for quite a while. and his life continued to do nothing. But eventually he read it, and he found it extremely compelling. He said that what he learned in that book changed his life, and it set him on a quest to learn everything that he could about this mysterious power of mind. And just 10 years later, using what he had learned in that book, he was making more money in a single month than most people do in 10 years. With this newfound wealth, he dramatically changed his life. A couple of the things that he did was to buy his own plane and get his pilot's license. Then, on March 10th, 1981, while flying over Chesapeake Bay, his plane's engine died, and his plane dropped like a rock. Moments later, it ripped through some electrical lines and crashed into a field below. Luckily, some people saw the plane go down, and they called for help. 20 minutes later, Morris was in the hospital, and his family was told that most likely he wouldn't make it through the night. And if somehow he did, well, he'd be paralyzed for the rest of his life. He had completely crushed his spinal cord, and he couldn't even breathe without a respirator. Miraculously, he did survive the night, and a grueling 9-hour operation. And in the morning, his family was extremely grateful that he was alive. But just as the doctors had predicted, he was in fact paralyzed. He had broken his C1 and his C2. Those are the top two vertebrae in the neck. And as a matter of fact, he could only communicate by blinking his eyes. Well, at first, he felt that all hope was lost. But then he remembered something he had learned, something he had read once. Quote, "When you turn on a light switch, you don't create the electrical power. You simply release the power that's already there and that has been there the entire time." Unquote. So according to Morris, from that moment on, he got to work on his thoughts. And using the same power of mind that had taken him from rags to riches, he worked on healing his body. The doctors said that he would never breathe without a respirator. So this was the very first thing that he tackled. Day after day, he visualized himself breathing on his own. Then, once his vision got clear enough, according to Morris, miraculously, his body somehow rebuilt the muscles and the nerve connections, allowing him to breathe at will. And on May 25th, 1981, only 2.5 months after the crash, he was taken off of the respirator. Well, the doctors were all baffled, but not half as baffled as they were about to be. Even though he was paralyzed from the neck down, he set a goal to walk out of the hospital before Christmas. And then, just 8 months later, an entire month before Christmas, Morris Goodman walked out of the hospital and was home by Thanksgiving. And although this is a miraculous story that seemingly defies modern medical understanding, the man in our next story, well, he actually stopped time. Neville Lancelot Goddard was born on February 19, 1905, to a British family in St. Michael, Barbados. He was the fourth of 10 children, and he grew up in a Christian home. He thought that his dream was to become a dancer. So at 17 years old, he moved to New York City to study dance. And he got pretty good at it. He actually made a career dancing on stage and in silent films, and he even danced on Broadway. Then, when he was only 24 years old, he said that something happened that changed his life forever. And it set him on a quest to study the powers of the mind and the mystic arts. And over the years, Neville said that he learned that everything is source energy, and that each of us has the ability to tap into unlimited power and actually manipulate reality. But, according to Neville, learning is one thing, and doing, well, that's quite another. And even though, he said, at this point in his life, he could access this power on a very limited scale, he wasn't even close to accomplishing the things that he had studied. Then, one evening in 1931, he met a very powerful and confident man who Neville said was as dark as the ace of spades and as wise as the teachers of old. The man had divine understanding of the ancient writings, and he began to teach Neville the things that the books couldn't.
When I first met my friend Abdullah back in 1931, I entered a room where he was speaking. When the speech ended, he came over, extended his hand, and said, "Neville, you are 6 months late." I'd never seen the man before, so I said, "I'm 6 months late. How do you know me?" And he replied, "The brothers told me that you were coming and you are 6 months late." When Abdul called me by my name, I said, "I don't know you." And he replied, "Oh yes, you do, but you've forgotten. We were together in China thousands of years ago, but you promised to completely forget in order to play your part now."
Under Abdul's guidance, Neville studied every day, and at first, he was no closer to wielding the power of the universe than he had been before he had met Abdul. Abdul would teach him to focus, that the power was in clarity of thought, and knowing, not just believing, was the key. But Neville would constantly want to cut corners, and one day, Neville expressed the desire to visit his home in Barbados. He told Abdul that he didn't have the money to go, and he wanted to wield the power of mind to get him there. So Abdul gave him the mental tools, and he coached him on how to make this happen. Several times, Abdul would teach him one thing, and Neville would do another. More than once, their sessions would end with Abdul walking away and slamming a door, refusing to teach Neville for the rest of the day. Finally, Neville said that he thought that maybe he could get a third-class ticket and scrounge up enough money to go. This enraged Abdul, and he told Neville that one does not wield the very powers of the universe with ideas of scrounging and third class. This session, too, ended with Abdul walking away and slamming a door. Eventually, Neville stopped cutting corners, and he actually committed, and within just a few months, he received a letter from his brother asking him to come home and visit, as the entire family was going to meet for Christmas. Along with the letter was a first-class ticket to Barbados. This experience changed Neville Goddard's life, and it showed him that this power was more real than he had thought, and shortly after this, he was wielding this power almost as effectively as the fictional character Dr. Strange does. Neville stayed in control of this power from the mid-1930s until his death in 1972, which eerily he predicted. During this time, he manifested money, attracted the love of his life, and he even healed the sick. But by far, the most extraordinary thing that he did was travel back to the 1700s and stop time. In 1948, Neville had gotten so proficient at controlling reality that he began playing with the idea of manipulating the very fabric of time itself. On several occasions, he would get himself alone and focus on experiencing another dimension or traveling through time. This, of course, was one of the most difficult things that he had ever attempted, but he kept trying. And then one day, he was actually able to do it. He pushed himself out of the present and into the past. Neville said that he journeyed back to the mid-1700s, and he found himself in one of the first 13 colonies on the eastern border of the United States. Although impressive, traveling through time, that, at least in my mind, pales in comparison to what he did once he got there. While exploring the mid-1700s, Neville found himself in what he later described as a gracious dining room with well-dressed customers and busy waitresses. And as he stood there, soaking it all in, he wanted to see if he could push things just a little bit further and actually stop time itself. This would be different than him just traveling through time, because traveling through time implies that he was the one moving. but time remained constant. But stopping time, well, that would mean that he had control over time itself. So Neville looked around the dining room, and using everything that he had learned up to this point in his life, he focused hard and he summoned the power within him.
My head gelled. It became solid. At that moment, the perceiver, I was awake and I could change my attention, but within the focus of my vision, everything froze. The diners who were dining dined not. One young lad, about 22 years old, bringing his soup spoon to his mouth, froze. And he couldn't move one moment beyond where I froze him. Father and mother on both sides. A waitress came through the door and she started walking and she froze. She couldn't move. A bird in flight, it froze. The leaves falling, they froze. The grass weaving with the wind, it froze. Everything froze. I examined the whole thing. It was dead. The life was in me. And when I released that power within me, everything continued on its course. The boy completed the action of bringing the soup to his mouth. The waitress completed her action of walking to the table, bringing the second course. The bird that was arrested in flight continued on its flight. And the leaves resumed falling.
If Neville Goddard's story is true, then he did things that nearly everyone today would say could only be found in the pages of fiction. But as I said earlier, Neville claimed that we all have this power, and it's just a matter of understanding that fact, learning how to focus, and then practicing until it becomes second nature. Perhaps the scariest thing that Neville ever said about this power was that it is no respecter of persons, and it can be used for evil just as easily as it can be used for good. Neville always claimed that there was a darker side to this power. Perhaps it was this darker side that Josephine used to murder her husbands. Josephine Gray grew up studying the power of mind through Voodoo, and she married her first husband, Norman Stribling, in 1967. Shortly after they were married, Mr. Stribling learned that it was not a good idea to argue with Josephine. According to a relative, Josephine, not happy with something that he did or said, placed a magical spell on him, and shortly after this, for reasons that make no sense and have yet to be explained, he himself began to, now, check this out, uncontrollably scratch his own face. And he did so until his face was, according to relatives, scratched to shreds. That's chilling. Such was the power of Josephine Gray. Josephine placed other hexes on a number of people that many believe came true. So, when her first husband was found dead in his car from a gunshot wound in 1974, and the police went around interviewing everyone, no one dared point to or even suggest that Josephine might have had something to do with it. Eventually, the case went cold and Josephine went on with her life. And then she married her second husband, William Robert Gray. And just like Norman Stribling, Mr. Gray also learned that it wasn't wise to argue with Josephine. Her reputation for casting hexes that came true, was growing. And soon, nearly everyone believed she had this power. Then, one evening in November of 1990, Mr. Gray walked into his own house, and he was shot and killed while he was crossing the threshold. Once again, an investigation was opened, and just like before, everyone knew that Josephine had something to do with it. And just like before, no one said a word. In any case, her house was thoroughly searched, but except for finding some strange-looking dolls with pins in them and other voodoo paraphernalia, no evidence pointing to Josephine as the murderer was found. So the case remained unsolved. And not long after this, Josephine began dating a man named Clarence Good. And I'm sure at this point you can guess what happened to Mr. Good. After too many disagreements where Josephine just did not get her way, on June 21st, 1996, Mr. Good's body was found stuffed into the trunk of his own car with a bullet hole in his back. By this time, even the investigators believed that Josephine had done it. But her reputation for being able to wield the very power of the universe and cast black magic hexes on others was so great that even the investigators were afraid of Josephine. Thomas Tam, Montgomery County Assistant State's Attorney, went on record, and he said that fear permeated the entire case. James Trusty, Assistant United States Attorney, said that during one of the investigations, police wiretapped Josephine's home, and they recorded a ritual in which she mentioned the investigators by name and, quote, cast harm upon them. Although there had been 3 murders surrounding Josephine, investigators just could not find enough evidence to convict her. It was as if any and all evidence had just magically vanished into thin air. So, being unable to get her on murder charges, the police went after her for insurance fraud. She had collected over $150,000 in the deaths of these 3 men. She was finally convicted, and she received a 40-year prison sentence. She is now known as the Voodoo Killer. And it's not at all clear whether the inmates avoid her magical ways or whether they just take their chances. Allegedly, Josephine used the power of black magic to murder her 3 lovers. But the woman in our next story, well, she used this power to murder nearly 300. Unlike our first 3 stories, history doesn't have a lot of information on this next person. We do know that Julia Bernard was born in New Orleans, Louisiana around 1845. Like Josephine from our last story, at some point in her life, Julia began to study the power of mind through the practice of voodoo. And right off of the bat, she found that she was pretty good at it. At first, Julia used her power to enrich others, and living in New Orleans, her love of magic was happily accepted. Many of the residents there also practiced voodoo. But sometime around 1880, she married a man named Celestin Brown, and shortly after that, the couple moved away from New Orleans to the smaller town of Frenier, Louisiana. Frenier didn't have very many people practicing voodoo, if they had any at all, so they weren't really accustomed to someone like Julia practicing voodoo. But they didn't have a doctor either, and Julia, now pretty proficient with wielding the power of the universe through voodoo, used her power to help heal the sick there in Frenier. So at first, the townspeople accepted Julia and her voodoo-wielding ways. But story has it that at some point, the town's mindset began to shift. People started to whisper and gossip, saying that Julia was a child of the devil. But whenever someone got sick, of course, having no other options, they would still call for Julia. And Julia wasn't stupid. She knew that most of the people thought that she was evil, but having a good heart, still she would help. And while the person was sick, he or she would beg, plead, and be grateful for her help. However, after the person was healed, he or she would go back to distancing himself or herself and whispering negative comments about Julia. Well, it didn't take long until Julia began to feel completely taken advantage of. So, out of anger, she would occasionally scare the locals, predicting when something bad was about to happen to someone. And after a while, she developed a reputation for being a great healer, but also of someone who could place a real-life curse on others. Eventually, the town got a doctor, and through the years, the townspeople shied further and further away, until Julia was almost completely left alone.
People became ungrateful of her kindness, which led her to practice darker voodoo and curses that terrified the neighborhood. She was known for making hand gestures that no one could understand, staring at others with an intensity that would terrify a holy man.
While in her older years, the people of Frenier who passed in front of her house said that they saw her sitting on the porch like an old crone and singing an eerie incantation that went something like this.
One day I'm gonna die. I'm gonna take you all with me, and one day I'm gonna die. Everything will die along with me.
This, of course, only made the townspeople shun her more, which in turn fueled her anger and it strengthened her resolve. And then, on September 28th, 1915, Julia Brown died, and the entire town was gripped with fear, remembering that song and thinking that they too were soon going to die. So in a last-ditch effort to appease her spirit and hopefully avoid certain death, the entire town attended the funeral. And some people say that just as the casket was being lowered into the grave, the winds began to howl, and they picked up so quickly and so violently that the townspeople all abandoned the corpse and ran for cover. But they couldn't run far enough or fast enough to hide from Julia's curse. History reports that nearly 300 people died that day in one of the biggest storms of the century. So how much of this report is true? Well, it's clearly documented that Morris Goodman was told that he would never walk again. And according to Goodman, using nothing but the power of thought, he did indeed walk out of that hospital. And everything I shared about Neville Goddard has been documented. But most of that documentation was done by Neville Goddard himself. So there's very little corroborating evidence to support his claims. But, believe it or not, his legacy lives on. And there are now millions of people all around the world who study his teachings. And they claim that every day they wield the power of the universe to manifest money, love, and health. As far as Josephine Gray goes, most of the people today believe that there was nothing really magical about her and that she just scared everyone into thinking that she had magical powers. And Julia Brown, well, as I said when I started that section, history doesn't have a lot of information about her. We do know that she practiced voodoo, and supposedly she helped heal people, and we also know that a hurricane really did hit Louisiana the day that she was buried. But whether or not she actually sang songs about dying and taking everyone with her, well, history only reports this as verbal statements passed down over time. And it could very well have been that after the hurricane hit, some people made up those stories just to make it more eerie. But as far as Dr. Dean Radin goes, well, his experiments into the power of the mind, they aren't as easily dismissed. So what do you have for us today?
All right. You know that feeling you get when you feel like you're being watched?
Yeah.
It's creepy, right?
Yes.
So Dean Radin collected 33,000 trials on this feeling that someone is watching you.
All right.
Okay. And they're trying to find out, do people really sense that?
Okay.
Okay. Without being told, right? You would think that's a 50-50.
Right.
You sense you're being watched, you're being watched. You sense it, but you're not.
Right.
Okay. So the results of those 33,000 trials should be 50%.
Yes.
It's not.
I didn't think so.
So it's 54% of the time people accurately determined they were being watched when they were.
How many trials did you say was this was?
It's like 33,300 and something.
So let me see if I get this right. Out of 33,000 trials, people accurately predicted 54% of the time whether they're being watched or not.
Exactly.
That's giving me, that's raising the hairs on the back of my neck right now.
I feel like I'm being watched right now.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. That's crazy, right? So what are the odds of that?
Right. So the math works out to this. So the odds are 1 to 202 octodecillion. There's a 1 in chance.
I've never heard of that number. How many zeros is that number?
It's a 1 with 57 zeros behind it.
So that should prove that there's something to being able to sense whether or not someone's watching you, right?
Exactly. And that's what Dean Radin says in his book, Real Magic. Like, this should be the end of my book. We're done. Yes. The mind does have these powers.
That's crazy.
Right? Yeah.
So, like, our subscribers, right? So one of my subscribers sits there and thinks they're being watched. There's a 54% chance you're being watched.
Oh my gosh. Yeah,
it's true, right? That's what you're saying. This is proven.
Yeah, but you just took it to a different level.
Well, after something like that, we don't need any voodoo study talks now.
I know, but I really want to share this. It's pretty fast.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So Dean Radin decided, let's take this study on being watched to using
the next level.
We're going to take it to a next level. Let's use a voodoo doll. Okay.
Okay.
So the setup was, I'll simplify it. So person A makes a voodoo doll of themselves.
Okay.
Okay. Person B gets said voodoo doll.
Okay.
Right. And as person B is mentally, they're looking at the voodoo doll, they're interacting with the voodoo doll. Person A, they are measuring incredible physiological responses. These guys,
this is a scientific study.
Yes.
In a laboratory environment, controlled environment.
Controlled environment. They're not even in the same building, let alone the same floor.
You're giving me chills. No lie. So...
Yeah. And they didn't do a ton of these studies, right?
Yeah.
I think he has 160 data points, but that's still a lot of points, right? Where this person has a response that
whenever this person's focusing
the
doll.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah. So, Dr. Radin said, you have to be careful in my line of work. He's a professor, and you can't just go to the college board and say, I want to do a large scale study on voodoo. Okay. And
what happened when they poked the doll with needles?
10 years. Stop. He said they didn't give him any needles.
Really?
There was none of that. It was positive. Supposed to be positive.
Of course. Yeah.
Anyway.
That would have been creepy though, right?
I almost want to do that.
Take this doll and go poke it with needles.
Oh my gosh.
And then the other person's going, ah!
Now rope goes to a whole new level.
No. So, but seriously, you're saying that out of 160 trials or whatever it was, that there was significant evidence that whenever they focused on that doll, this person had a physiological change.
Exactly.
Is that what you're saying?
You got it.
That's insane.
It's exciting.
It's crazy. What they don't know is that we're sitting here alone in the house. It's like you give me the creeps when you talk about this. And in case you don't know, I don't know what she's going to say. I have an idea. That's it. So these are not scripted conversations.
No, clearly not. By the way, I trip over my words, but it's how I am in real life, right? I trip on air, so it's perfect that I can trip on my words.
So I got to ask you before we go.
Okay.
So I asked you before in a different report if you believe that there is anything to the power of mind, and you said yes. But this report's a little bit different, right? Because this report kind of says that everything is source energy and we're connected to source. So what do you believe about that?
I'm going to flip this around this time, okay? Instead of asking me, I'm going to ask you, what do you believe about powers of the mind? What do you believe about source energy?
That's not fair. Well, you know that when I was very young, I had a near-death experience. I call it a death experience. I was dead for 7 minutes. Yeah. And now they know. One day maybe we'll share it. I don't really want to get into it now, but I'll say this. When that happened, and I experienced that, I didn't experience space and time. It's like it vanished. And I can't explain that. But it's as if all there was mind, consciousness. You know that.
It still just baffles me every time you talk about it.
So I have to say, yes, when you see something, when you experience it,
right.
Maybe you can't explain it. I can't explain it, but I can say that I can no longer ignore it. So no, I don't think that there's just atoms in a void. I think that there's definitely something to this source energy kind of thing. I think everything is connected.
Wow.
Does this sound weird?
No, not at all. And you know what? Thank you for sharing.
You're welcome. So, what do you think? Is the power of mind real? Can a person really manipulate reality with just thought alone? You know, this report reminds me of the Elizabeth Cornish case. Elizabeth was murdered in her own apartment in 1987, and the police strongly suspected that her boyfriend was the killer, but they had no evidence to prove it. And then a psychic got involved, and using some sixth sense, or the power of mind, if you will, she helped the police to solve the case. It's fascinating because she truly did know things that she couldn't possibly have known, even helping the police locate the murder weapon that was hopelessly lost in a body of water. We did a complete report on this case, and the psychic involved, Nancy Weber, she actually came on our show, and she shared this case firsthand with us. It's a very interesting report, and if you'd like to see it, it's here. Thank you very much for watching this report. And you know what? We've got our store open now.
Check it out.
It's on Fourth Wall.
Yeah.
How do they get there?
Fourth Wall reports. There's links.
There's a link.
There's a link in the description of every video.